start by just enhancing my introduction. My name is Benedict Austin Francis Abonyo Omollo. That's very important because that's a unique combination. I'm married and I have 4 children. Now, the reason why I need to say 4 children is because I'll center my discussions around my children and my engagement with child ministry. My firstborn is 20 years. This is where you need to say, oh, you don't look like you have a 20-year-old. My firstborn is 20 years old. He's a third year at the university, Riara University. My secondborn, he's a boy. It's called Odundo. My secondborn is called Ngoshi. He's 14 years in year 10. And then I have twin daughters who are 9 years old. And that's where we stopped. In the Kenyan parlance, just in case we get others, we could end up with triplets. And we would be on TV saying, tunaomba serikali itusaidie. So we hope not to get any more. Pastor Mbiti asked me to talk this morning on child ministry and the church. However, what I decided to do was to push it a bit and focus more on a layman's reflections, having served with SOS Children's Villages for many years. And then I worked with Compassion International for a number of years. And then I worked with Biblica, who are the sponsors of the NIV for several years. And then moved on to government and back to private sector. And so I thought that it would be important for me to give my reflections now that I am not particularly engaged in child ministry, but having been there, to look back and say, are there some things that we could have done differently, and could we have been more effective? And so I look at it from the perspective of a parent, having been a parent, and as you can see, I have somebody just who's left teenage, I have a teenager, and I have, what are they called? Preteens. 9-year-olds are classified as what? Preteens, I hope. And so I'd be able to look at that and ask some questions. Are there some gaps that may have happened? Number 1, calling. Calling. As I have reflected on the issues of child ministry and child development, one of the challenges I've had is how we as Christians participate in helping our children find their calling. If we look at the book of Judges, the life of Samson becomes an interesting part to begin. Manoah and his wife are eager to start Samson on the right platform. Indeed, in Judges chapter 13 and verse 12, when the angel had come and left, Manoah insists that, please, could he come back? And he does. But there are some important words that Manoah asks. He says, when your words are fulfilled, what is to be the rule that governs the boy's life and work? What is to be the rule that governs the boy's life and work? And I have often reflected and asked myself, how intentional have I been in helping the young people who have passed through my hands in trying to understand the rules that would govern their life and their work? Similarly, when we look at the story and the birth of John the Baptist in the book of Luke, chapter 1 and verse 66, again, this comes out. And it says that everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, what then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hands was with him. What then? Have we thought and considered what will this child be? Now, I know that some children are actually conceived in a hurry, and there is no real formula, or no angel comes our way and gives us this kind of instructions. The responsibility seems to be placed with the parents in the first instance. However, the case of Samuel seems to change it, because Samuel indeed is brought to somebody whom we can consider a failed father, because the sons of Eli are not particularly spoken about with high regard. But interestingly, Samuel's mother brings Samuel to the house of the Lord. And I have often wondered, is there a place that we as the church, as the congregation, do we have a responsibility then to shape and help these young people find their calling? I have often had several sermons and preachings on Proverbs 22 verse 6. Start children off on the way they should go, and even when they are old, they will not turn from it. And there has been a lot of focus on that in terms of teaching and helping children when they are young. I have often asked the question, why does the Bible seem to jump the teenage years? And those of you who are with a master's degrees in theology could break that down. But I have often tried to think, is there a reason that the Bible has jumped from childhood to when they are older? And should we then be more gracious with our teenagers? Of course, those of us who have teenagers know that it's quite a challenge to manage them. Now, I understand and appreciate the saying, and I love this particular saying, It says that grandchildren are God's gift to us for not killing our teenagers. And that is particularly true for those of you who've had teenagers and have grandchildren. Somehow, when we grew up, my parents were particularly strict, very strict. But when the grandchildren came, there was this freedom that they were allowed in my parents' house. They were allowed to touch things which we were not allowed to when we were growing up. They were allowed to do things which we were not allowed to ever do. And so, more and more as I reflect on this statement, I tend to think there's something, and perhaps there's a reason why the Bible jumps the whole issue of teenage. Recently, the Williams sisters, Serena and Venus, won the Wimbledon double again. I think for several years they've won it. And for me, the whole story and the passion that the father had, and the story of the Williams sisters as success stories in tennis, comes back to mind. It was their father's dream that these two girls would be stars in tennis. It wasn't their dream. And he coached them himself for several years. And so as I go back to the story of calling, I wonder whether we need not be very intentional about giving direction, including work and life, for our own children, and helping them to become that which we have dreamt. Mark 10, 13 to 16 is one of my favorite passages. This is the story of Jesus blessing children. One of the challenges, and I have reflected on this, the only time I have observed when the pastor, at least the senior pastor and the bishops, touch children is during baby dedication. And perhaps some of you are pastors and church leaders. I only see it happening during baby dedication. But thereafter, children are always called to the front and then they're dismissed to go for their Sunday school. But I rarely see senior pastors, bishops engaging with children thereafter. But when I look at this passage of scripture, it amazes me that as the disciples were restraining people from bringing children to Christ, the Bible tells us that Jesus carried each child in his arms and blessed them. Now here you need a sense of imagination, because if you think about it, normally, on average, they say there were 5,000, 4,000 men. There could be double the number of women. I mean, this is very figurative of it. And there must have been lots of children as well. Now, when you think about it, if Jesus stopped and laid his hands on each child, it must have been a full day assignment. It must have taken a long while. Now, what do you think Jesus was doing as he picked each child, laid his hands on them? What was he doing? Perhaps he was binding some demons for those who are going to be wayward. Perhaps he was prophesying on each one individually. But we don't see that happening in our churches anymore. It's a mass prayer, which is done quickly to get rid of the children. And so I challenge us, and as I've reflected, I've asked myself, how would I stop and spend time on a one to listen more, to bless each one individually, and understand their calling? Secondly, disciplines and doctrines. Recently, a friend of mine told me that they had reverted back to the Catholic Church. They felt that evangelical churches did not seem to capture the passion of the Christ appropriately over the Easter period. As I introduced myself this morning, I mentioned my names: Benedict, Francis. It definitely should resonate with you that I was born a Catholic. And the last two popes, I share names with them. If that were the basis, I would make it to heaven very quickly. But I remembered and I recalled that indeed, the way we would go through the Easter seasons as Catholics was a bit different, because we had a very clear process of remembering the stages of the cross. It's quite deep. As evangelicals, sometimes we quickly move, and I'm not so sure that I even understand some of the disciplines and doctrines that we have. Our statement of faith. I don't think I have had lots of preachings in my church about our statement of faith or our creed. Why do we believe certain things? But what puzzles me is that most Muslims tend to know why they believe what they believe. And so I struggle with the issue of disciplines, routines, rituals that help. And so what I've done is that when I'm in Nairobi, I'm a good Pentecostal, and that's fine. But often when I go back to the village, I tend to be an Anglican, just so that some rituals and processes come in, just to get a balance.